speaker is Mary Lou Hastings from the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. So that is George Mitchell of the Father of Fracking Foundation. She is there and helps distribute money to aspiring researchers like some of us in the room. And she is going to give a talk entitled, "Who is the Man Behind the Curtain? Philanthropy's Role in the Transition to Clean Energy." So if you want to know how philanthropy tries to distribute their limited dollars to lots of people trying to ask for funding on their favorite research project or policy activity, this is the talk to come to. So she is in this business, and as she will tell you, Texas is not the easiest place to do business on some environmental and clean energy issues. So she's a very knowledgeable person, and that'd be a great talk. So today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is a remote, Dr. Yaneer Bar-Yam, who I met 2 summers ago, the summer of 2015, at a very rough conference to hang out on the southern coast of Spain.
It was terrible, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah, it was very horrible. And this conference was entitled "Physics Meets the Social Scientists." I'm neither a physicist nor a social scientist, but I wanted to go. Dr. Bar-Yam is a physicist, and he does deal a lot with how the interaction of principles of physics and how they interact with social sciences, phenomenon, a lot to do with economics. So that's going to be I anticipate, a bit of his talk today. So to say he's an interesting individual, I think, is an understatement. So he's currently the director and founder of New England Complex Systems Institute, and he has an appointment at MIT. He's written books, and he has several papers on the idea of understanding complex systems dynamics, and how to apply these, both thinking about the theory and how to apply these to real-world problems. He advises government officials, he advises government agencies, he advises private businesses on how to use concepts from physics and complex systems to analyze what are becoming more and more complex situations. And it says here in his bio, his research on the global food crisis leading up to the financial crisis at the end of the last decade was cited among the top 10 discoveries in science by Wired magazine. So looking at the intersection of energy, biofuels, energy and food, and the role of those policies in the world. So with that introduction, I will attempt to turn it over now to Dr. Bar-Yam, and tuning in from New York, I believe. So, Yaneer, have at it. If we have a question in the audience at any time during his talk, please raise your hand, and our 2 microphone coordinators will, I guess, say the word "question," so that Yaneer, you know that there's a question, and then we'll hand the microphone off to the person with the question. So he's trying to encourage people to have questions during his talk. We'll see if we can pull it off. Yaneer, take it away.
Hi, how are you doing today? Okay, yeah, nod your heads. That'll be easier for me to see since I can't hear you individually. What's the temperature like there? I guess, I don't know. I'll have to look it up. I can't hear you. So, ask questions. I've heard this talk before, at least not exactly this talk, but some like it. So I don't need to do this again for me. I would be really interested in your question. And I know this is an energy course, and people there who are attending are interested in energy issues. So I'm going to talk more generally about complex systems and how it applies to some of the problems we're facing in the world. And if we want to chat about energy, I'll be happy to do that. We've been asked by some people who are in the industry to start helping out in that context, and we're looking for, sort of key avenues forward. And maybe we will end up having an opportunity to talk about it and to collaborate or other things. So please do ask. In the meantime, I will move forward with sort of a basic presentation, the title that I gave you. Can you see that? What is the world coming to? You can see that? Good.
Yep.
So, so here's a start. Do you guys recognize this? Do you
Matrix, I
recognize
suppose.
this? The matrix, right. This is kind of the world as data. Right? These are streaming numbers flowing down your screen, representing things happening in the world, and therefore this is kind of the world as data. Now, traditional statistics, which many of you have studied, will take two of these time series and will correlate with them with each other. And then if you want to study something else, you'll take two other time series and correlate them with each other. One of the big shifts that is happening now, and this is really a part of complex system science, is that we look at patterns across all the data. And by looking at the patterns across all the data, we can ask different kinds of questions and gain different kinds of insights. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So now, if we think about what statistics is good at, statistics is really good at the stuff on the upper left, i.e. independent things. And if we add dynamics, i.e. calculus, then we're good at describing dependent things like on the right. What statistics and calculus are not good at is describing something like this flock of sterlings and their behaviors, because the behaviors are at multiple scales. And this is where complex systems enables us to go beyond calculus and statistics to think about what's happening in this context. So I'm going to go back a little bit in history and talk about sort of the statistics and how the revolution happened. And again, when you have statistics, the central limit theorem, which you may have probably have studied, tells us that when we combine the behavior of all the parts, we get a normal distribution, a bell curve. Now, that doesn't apply when you have dependencies in the system. And the place where this got really uncovered in a very strong way is in the study of phase transitions in materials. So, for example, the boiling of water. Can you see my arrow here on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so here we have ice, then we have water, and we have steam. Now, the line between water and steam is the boiling point of water. So if we take the same pressure and we raise the temperature, we go from ice to water and then to steam. If we raise the pressure, then we go from water to steam here, and then eventually this line ends. What that means is that we've squeezed the water molecules so tightly to each other that the difference between sort of rolling around that happens with water and bouncing around that happens with steam doesn't exist anymore. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. End of this line is called a second order phase transition point. And when this was studied, and this is about 100 years ago or more, like 120 years ago, and they looked along this line to see how the change in density, right? So along this line, there's a discontinuous change in density. I can plot that discontinuous change in density here, and you see that if we go along that line, we start from 0 and then it goes up, and the shape of that curve is described by a power law. So it has a shape that goes like x, where x is this coordinate, the horizontal coordinate, to some power delta. Delta can be calculated in a theory that is assuming calculus and statistics. And when you calculate it, you get a number, 0.5. That's it. There's no ambiguity. This is the most general theory that you can write down that assumes calculus and statistics. Okay?
Okay.
So once you've written it down, you go to experiment. And the problem is that the experiment tells us the answer is about a third. Now, there's a lot of things that you can say, but a half and a third are just not the same number. I think we can all agree. So it turns out that there was a need to create an entirely new mathematics to figure this out. And the new mathematics was described by Ken Wilson in a paper in 1970. The term for it is called Renormalization Group. And basically what it says is that the material isn't described by average density. It fluctuates between water-like and vapor-like. And the fluctuations happen at all scales. And if you leave out the fluctuations, you cannot get the right answer. And so you have to change the math in order to look as a function of scale is the trick, in order to figure out how to calculate the right answer, which comes out correctly from the theory about a third. So this was a totally different way of thinking about both math and about physics. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is sort of carrying this idea forward into the social sciences, where calculus and statistics are being used. And we need to figure out how to use them in this context. And one of the key ideas that I use in this context is something called the complexity profile. So the vertical axis here is the amount of information. You can call it the complexity. It's the amount of information necessary to describe a system. The horizontal axis is the scale is being looked at. Now, if you keep looking at larger and larger of the system, the amount of information tends to go down. Detail, fine scale. And the large scale stuff is sitting out here. Question. Is there a question?
Does anyone have a question? We did lose you for some time, like a few seconds ago. 30 seconds ago.
You lost me?
I mean, we couldn't hear you.
What did you lose? Did you
30
lose
seconds
just this
ago.
description? So all I said is that this is the information describing the system as a function of scale. So as we lose detail, you have less and less information to describe. Is that clear?
Yep.
All right, so now it turns out that when we care about big stuff, and policy generally cares about big stuff, we only care about the biggest things, that's the tail. So part of the trick of Renormalization Group is to help you figure out the biggest stuff that's going on. And that's what it's used for. So one of the problems in traditional science is that we always assume that things have normal distributions. Now I'm kind of a little bit simplifying the discussion, but you don't want to use a normal distribution if what you really have is a wave. Or if you have these patterns in space called Turing patterns or flows like Navier-Stokes equation or other things. So the trick is to figure out what is the biggest thing that's happening in the system and then build a more detailed picture on top of that. And that's the tool that we mostly use to figure out what's going on in the world. Is there a question? Are there any questions?
No questions so far.
Okay. So now let's talk about the world. And the main thing that we know about the world today is it's becoming more connected. And as it becomes more connected, things like the financial crisis propagate around the world. And the Arab Spring is a global event with lots of countries engaged in it. And if we have an epidemic, we have ISIS, people go there from all over the world to participate and also go there from all over the world to oppose it. And there's the Ebola epidemic that was a global concern. And for people in Texas, you know that it reached Texas, right?
Yep.
So it's a global problem. So I'm going to start talking about this starting from a particular place. And that place is Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring. Do you see the picture?
Yes.
Okay, good. And one of the key questions that we might ask is, why did this happen? And the standard answer that most people would give is that there were bad dictators. But these dictators were around for 20, 30, or 40 years, so surely it's not a good answer to why it happened in 2010, 11. So here's a better answer. This line, the black line here, is global food prices. These red dashed lines over here are food riots in many different places. The parentheses are the number of deaths in those riots. This is the Arab Spring. Make sense? It's
Yes.
pretty natural. If food prices go up, people get desperate and they riot. Lives are in danger if they can't feed their families. They're going to go to the streets. And that's not what's surprising about this. There are several things that are surprising. One is that there seems to be a certain threshold, like 210, where all hell breaks loose, like a boiling point. And the other is that these are global food prices. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Here's a map of the global supply of food. Now, energy, like food, is a global market. What that means is that prices are set for the entire world. So even though people grow food locally in many, the price of food is actually a global thing. And that means when the prices go up, it's not just our prices. It's everybody's price, and that's why there are riots and revolutions around the world. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. There's a subtext here. You see this blue dashed line?
Yes.
That's the date we sent a report to the government saying high food prices, social unrest, political instability. That was 4 days before Mohamed Bouazizi started things in Tunisia. So we get some credit for anticipation. Now, the next figure, and I'm going to put this in full screen so I can show you this as a video. Can you still see this? Someone say yes.
Yes.
Okay. This is food prices from 1980 to the present. Do you notice something? This recent period of time is totally different from what happened before. So there's got to be a reason for this. So we spent some time figuring out the reason. And so the question is why, and the answer that many people gave, or the answers that many people gave, have to do with things like a drought in Australia, the fact that China was developing, so there's a change of diet. And when people start eating meat, the meat eats more grain than if people eat it. So that changes the amount of grain that's needed. There's also corn to ethanol conversion in the US. Right? That's a biofuel policy. It's associated with the energy industry, which is related to what you're talking about, presumably. Then there are things like speculation on markets, which the economists say, well, some say it's causing things, some say it has nothing to do with things, it can't cause things, but there's no numbers. Then there's currency conversion, particularly euro to dollar conversion changes, and there's costs. Oil prices contributing to food prices. Why? Because when oil prices go up, the energy inputs to food production go up, and so maybe that's a cause. So how do we resolve this? So a normal way to do this is to take different time series and to correlate them. But you can correlate the movement of a fly with the food prices up and down. And if it correlates, does it have anything to do with global food prices? Not a chance. And ultimately the reason is because the fly isn't big enough. If the fly was really big, then it might affect global food prices. But because it's much smaller, it doesn't. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply that thinking to these items. And we'll start by looking at droughts in Australia. This gray line, if you can see it, is global change in grain production. The darker line is change in Australian grain production. Now you can argue whether there is or is not a drought here. But either way, the change of grain production in Australia is not large enough, because if it was big enough to change prices, then the global prices would be moving up much differently. You see that?
Yep.
All right, so that's out. We're just going to throw it out. It's gone. Here's the next one, change of China. So this blue line is the total grain exports and grain consumption, exports of China. China was a grain exporting country. So if you look at this, you'll see that the grain exports of China went down by 5 million metric tons. That's a lot of grain. And you might think that that's a big amount. But look at this red line. That's the consumption of corn to produce biofuels in the US. That's 10 times larger than this difference. So this is small. So we're just going to throw it out. By the way, people, when they talk about ethanol to corn conversion, they say, well, but there's feed byproduct, where they ferment the corn to make alcohol, which is ethanol. But the stuff that's left, the mash that's left, goes back to feed. And they say, well, that's a lot. Well, it is a lot, but it's only about a third. So we still have 2/3, and that's still an order of magnitude bigger than this. So we're just going to throw this out. Next. Here's the currency conversion rates, and I think there is a substance that is not legal in Texas that the economists were smoking when they came up with the idea that currency conversion rates were causing this, because it's the wrong sign. It's just the wrong direction. So they saw this peak over here, and it correlates with this peak over here. Of course, the correlation goes away a little bit later, but it's not the cause because it's the wrong direction. I won't give you the details, but you can look it up. Oil prices. Oil prices went up. So here's kind of a big dynamic picture. Can you see this, everyone?
Yeah.
So this is the mortgage market that crashed. So that's housing prices. This is the stock market crash. And notice there's a whole bunch of things that are peaking right after the stock market crash. Now that's kind of strange. Why would oil and corn and silver all peak at the same time? I mean, supply and demand of each one of them. I mean, in traditional economics, the supply of corn, the supply of oil, the supply of silver, and on the other side, the consumption of each of them, the demand, is what controls the prices.
Question.
It would be kind of surprising that all of them would do the same thing.
Question.
But they did. Yeah, question.
Is it because people are moving their assets into commodities? So you see a simultaneously increase in
Who said
demand.
that?
In
You get
demand.
the prize. Yeah, you absolutely get the prize. But notice that that has nothing to do with the supply and demand. It actually has the supply and demand of the investments. It's money movement. The speculation. Remember, there's a debate in economics whether speculation can play a role. So you've already guessed the answer, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what we see for first order discussion is that oil prices and food prices went up at about the same time. So maybe the oil prices going up caused the food prices to go up because it costs energy to make food. But if you look carefully, you actually see that oil prices peaked after wheat prices, 4 months later. So causality doesn't work that way. Oil prices did not cause wheat prices to go up. So we're going to have to look elsewhere. So we're just going to throw out the oil prices as a cause of food prices. If we do a supply and demand analysis, I won't go into this, it doesn't work. So what we're going to do, yeah? Question?
Laughter.
Okay. So is that laughter underlying, is there a question underlying the laughter? Challenge? I'm curious. I'd like to know.
They're entertained.
Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a mathematical model that includes just two things. That's it. Ethanol and speculation. And here's the model. Now, it's a simple dynamical model. It has the effect of ethanol. It has supply and demand, which means people that buy low and sell high, causing the price to go to equilibrium. And it has speculation. This means that people buy when the price goes up, driving it even higher, and sell when the price goes down, driving it down. And this is the mathematical version of the idea of speculation, at least the simplest version. And that's all we need. Remember, we're doing renormalization group, so we're going to do the biggest thing, and this is the biggest thing. And then we have one more thing that we have to add, which is the fact that money is slosh from market to market. So there are two different markets, the stock market and the bond market, and we're going to put in the money moving back and forth to those. So there are actually only two main parameters here, plus two sort of helper parameters. They're small, but they're important enough to include them. And this is what we get. The blue is the food prices. The red is the model. How did we do?
Pretty well.
Pretty well. Well, when we do the analysis statistically, the p-value is 10 to the minus 60. That's pretty darn good. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that ethanol is a big part of the problem. If you care about having prices that people can afford, our domestic ethanol policy is bad news. We are burning corn in our car engines. And you can look up, we've written a paper about how much corn, you know, how many, 1 gallon includes food to feed a person for a day, I think it is. It's a lot of food. So here is the effect of ethanol. And up until now, in fact, a little bit earlier, it's doubled global food prices. This, if you notice, the scale starts from about 100, and this is about 200. You see that?
Yep.
That's bad news. Here's the other bad news. This is the effect of speculation. When the markets crashed, people moved their money into the commodities markets, and the commodity market is a small market. The prices went sky high, and people stopped being able to buy it. Now, why did that happen? So the market crash is one of the reasons, but there's another reason. And this is the flip side of our country regulation and deregulation. This is the deregulation of the commodity markets. The commodity markets were deregulated back in 1999, 2000. And when they did that, they said, hey, markets don't need regulation. But what they had been doing is preventing a lot of people who are not investors in commodities normally from putting their money into commodities. And once those regulations were gone, all the money from the mortgage and stock market that wanted to go into the commodities market went. So this peak is huge because of that change in regulation. So we see that either regulation, as in, you know that, by the way, that ethanol is just a regulation? It's not a free market process. There's a government law that says how much ethanol should be converted into how much corn should be converted on, how much ethanol should be produced, and the only way we can produce it is from corn. In fact, today that law says that we should convert more, create more ethanol than can go into cars because we're limited to 10%. And the government hasn't changed that regulation despite the nonsense that's happening. So the regulations are silly, but the deregulations are just as wrong. So if you're in favor of regulation, or if you're not in favor, if you're in favor of deregulation, I have news for you. Sometimes regulations are bad and sometimes regulations are good. Questions?
Question.
Yeah, so talking about the deregulation, so that was from the 1999 law, the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, and things
That's
like
right.
that?
Commodities
Okay,
Futures
and then
Modernization Act.
And then
It was
there's
on Clinton. It was on Bill Clinton's march.
yeah,
The
I think it was a
ethanol
lame
was
duck.
on Bush's march. Bush's.
So, and I think that there are very limited margin requirements, so there's a lot more speculation possible in the commodities market that
Well, what they
that
really
turbocharges
did
this?
is it used to be that there were what are called position limits. Position limits limit the amount that any one investor can have in a particular future. These are futures markets. And the point is that they actually didn't eliminate them officially, but they created a bypass. So it turns out that people that are directly involved in commodities can get a waiver, so they don't have to have those limits. So these are people like the airlines that buy a lot of fuel, so they need to be able to buy as much fuel or as much futures contracts for fuel as they want, and they don't have those limits. But what they did is they create a bypass where they could create these swaps. And swaps enable banks, for example, to swap the ownership with an airline and then own a lot of oil. And the banks sell their ownership of oil in the form of funds called that are commodity investment vehicles. So that's how it works. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And then if you extend the analysis from 2011 to today, have corn prices come down substantially? What's the trajectory from 11 to 2016?
We'll get there,
Okay.
actually. But we'll talk about, why don't you ask me that again, because I'll bring it up a little bit today, and then make sure that you check in with me, because I'll tell you what's happening. Okay? So so what we see is that the peaks in these food prices are bubbles. People are buying and driving the price up, and then it gets so high that people start selling, and then they drive the price down. So these are bubbles and crashes, and there's an oscillation. So it happens, it was kind of supposed to happen here, but the stock market went up, pulling the money out of the commodity markets a bit, so it didn't go up, but then it went up again here. So this is like an oscillation. Here's another statement about this. So if prices are high compared to the equilibrium, this is the equilibrium that's set by the demand, including the ethanol demand. So this difference in price means that people are making food, i.e. they're producing it, but people can't buy it because they can't afford it. Supply and demand are out of whack. Now, Paul Krugman looked at this and said, we don't see the food in inventories. What happened to it? It can't be out of equilibrium. The problem is that he forgot that these are futures prices. And it means that people buy today for 6 to 12 months out. So lo and behold, you look 6 to 12 months out, and these are the inventories going sky high. This is the food that people couldn't buy. It's there. We have it. We're producing it. But we made the price system so out of whack that people can't buy it. This is enough grain to feed 2/3 of a billion people. Pretty bad. An out of whack economic system that doesn't enable people to eat. So this is kind of my picture of that. Now, we've extended the analysis a bit to fit the food prices. It turns out that the prices change direction. This is this other bubble. And the model fits, even if you don't change any parameters. You can tweak it a little bit, but it doesn't matter. So notice that the prices changed direction and the model changed direction. So it's a pretty significant prediction. Now, what happened afterwards is that the prices went down, but they were kind of on the trajectory down, and then there was the big drought in 2012. Do you remember that one? There was a huge drought in the U.S. Yep. And that's not in our model. But it drove the prices up. And then they kind of stabilized. So for a long period of time, they were at the same level, which if you notice is the level of 210, which we said, kind of all hell breaks loose above it. So it's kind of right at the boiling point. So we're going to get bubbles here and there. And if you look over that period of time, well, there are a lot of places that had, riots and revolutions. Now, not all of these may have to do with food, but there's a food component in a bunch of them. Now, what we did, our work was quite a bit publicized. So it was written up all over the place, major newspapers all over the world. And one of the organizations that noticed this is an organization called Food Watch in Germany. And they started a campaign called the Hunger Makers, where they put pictures on TV of the CEO of Deutsche Bank, along with hungry children in Africa, and said that the banking industry was complicit in world hunger because of this speculation business. And Deutsche Bank was one of the three major banks that did this: Goldman Sachs, Barclays, and Deutsche Bank. They were the leaders in this business. So Deutsche Bank was not necessarily happy with this. Now, what ended up happening is that a whole bunch of European banks pulled out of agricultural commodity trading. Now, this is not Deutsche Bank. They eventually said to us, they publicly said, oh, this is not important. But the other banks pulled out. Barclays is indicated here. They kind of did, kind of didn't. They said they did, but they didn't really. And then in 2014, January, the European Commission re-regulated their commodity markets. It doesn't mean that our commodity markets are regulated here. And the price setter is mostly the Chicago Board of Trade. But Europe re-regulated the commodities market. And they cited the following. They said this was in order to curb speculation on commodities and the disastrous impacts it can have on the world's poorest populations. So that's our work. So yes, we're kind of happy that we have impact on this. We wish we had more. In this country, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission tried to re-regulate the markets. They were blocked by the industry that sued them, a lawsuit, the judge in D.C., and they've been defunded by Congress, and they haven't been able to get back on track. It's been years in process. They have been trying, to their credit, but they haven't succeeded yet. It's all tangled in a massive government inaction. Now, I want to go back to this picture again that I showed you earlier. And by the way, there's a bill in front of both the House and the Senate on eliminating the ethanol rule. So just to update you about it, it used to be that the oil industry got a subsidy for every gallon of ethanol they used. And that made them happy. But they eliminated that subsidy. I don't remember the year. It may have been in 2000 and, I don't remember. It's during this period. Maybe 2010. Since then, the oil industry switched sides, and they've been trying to get Congress to eliminate this rule, the ethanol rule. And there are bills in front of both House and Senate, and nobody's been able to move them, even though both parties, in large numbers, are trying to eliminate this rule. So it's really just congressional inaction rather than any reason not to do this. So here's this picture that I had for you. This is the financial crisis. This is a more stock market crash. This is the commodity bubble in 2007-8, and this is the commodity bubble in 2010 and 11. We now understand why this has happened. It's the ethanol for the food plus the speculation for the other commodities. And we can trace what's happening. I'm going to show you this as a construction. These are the regulations that led up to the financial crisis. And we've done analysis of all of these pieces. You can look on our website for more. There was the banking deregulation in 1999, the commodity deregulation, which was 1999-2000. Then there's the biofuel mandates over here. There are two of them in 2005 and 2007. And then there's the stock market deregulation. I don't know how many of you know about these, but the stock market was deregulated in July of 2007. And the crash happened not long thereafter. So, I mean, you would think that someone would notice. And anyway, there's a lot I could say about this. But the result of this, and other things as well, is the mortgage crash, the stock market crash, the food crisis. Then there's the food crisis, more food crisis. Then there's the riots and revolutions around the world. And one of those was the revolution in Syria, which has destabilized governance there, leading to an incubation area for ISIS, and the European refugee crisis. And what we're seeing is this cascade of effects that's propagating around the world, from economic and social and to all kinds of problems. So this is our connected world in a nutshell, where everything is propagating around the world. Yes.
Thank you. Can you just go into a little bit of what rules were changed with the deregulation of the stock market and what effect that had for where the money went?
A whole bunch of stuff. That's the Uptick Rule. The Uptick Rule was put into place by the first SEC commissioner, happens to have the name Kennedy. Not accidentally, it was Joe Kennedy. It was after the market crash in 1929 and sort of the fluctuations in the market in the 1930s. And they instituted it to prevent market manipulation and market crashes. And what it does is it prevents people who borrow shares from selling when the price is going down. They have to price it above the current price. And we've done analysis of this up, down, and across. You can look on our website. And the analysis really shows that it's destabilized the markets to remove this regulation. And it's not in place still. The SEC put in a fake a few years later. So it's not a good thing. The markets are unstable now. The Fed, as many people are complaining, the Fed is propping them up. Okay?
Yep.
All right. In fact, we have something here about panics, and I'm not going to go into detail, but we have a measure of panicky behavior that if you mark it on the market, so this is, you start a measure of panicky behavior, and then you can show that panics happen afterwards, like one-day crashes. This is something that we've done. I want to go on to talk about Ebola. Because Ebola is another really important case of global connectivity gone bad. And I'm going to turn it into full screen mode, but please still ask questions, okay?
Okay.
So here's my dramatic slide. This is work that we started a long time ago. The green things that you're seeing on the screen are hosts, and the red are pathogens. This is a host pathogen model, and what's happening is that the pathogens are eating up the hosts. They're infecting them and causing them to die. Now, if you look at the pathogen, they mutate. The color changes a bit, so the colors are brighter red or duller red. And the bright red, particularly this area over here on the upper right, it spreads for a bit, but then dies out. So here's the question, extra credit question for all of those who are in the course. Let's see if I can put out of here.
Dr. Yaneer, just letting you know we have 15 more minutes.
Yeah, I got it.
All right.
So extra credit question, why do they die out? Anyone want to give a stab at it? The reason why the aggressive ones die out is that they kill all the hosts locally. And then they don't have anyone to infect. You got it? So they die out themselves. Now, what happens if we add long-range transportation to this business? So the answer is, and I'll just show you this, the slide has 4 different pictures on it, right? One is this color that you saw originally. As we add long-range transportation, the bad ones, the aggressive ones, escape and go to other places. And if you add more long-range links, they get more aggressive because they escape. And if you add more long-range links, they get even more aggressive. And then not only do they exist as more aggressive pathogens, but actually everything goes extinct. That's not a pretty picture. So this is kind of what I call the transition to extinction. It's like a boiling point, only in this case it's survival.
Question.
As we add more and more long-range links, we go from a unit probability of survival. Let me just finish this and then we'll do a question. And then there's a transition to a 0 probability of survival, i.e. everything dies. Yes, question.
So the question is on the last slide. If the long-range transportation or the long-distance transportation networks are also making it easier for diseases to spread, on the flip side, doesn't it also mean that fewer diseases are going to be quite as deadly because there are fewer isolated populations that haven't been exposed to the pathogen in the past?
It's a good question. It depends upon whether immunity is important enough. Right? Did they get immune? And so, you know, there are diseases that we survive and become immune to them. So for those, we might be less exposed. But there are diseases that are just deadly. So we don't actually get immune to them. We just die. See? So what do you think? So my answer to the question is we're in trouble. So what we did is we published a paper in 2006 that said, watch out for Ebola. Why did we say watch out for Ebola? Because it's this horrendous disease that was in faraway places in Africa. But what's far away? It's not farther than other places. It's just there wasn't much transportation there. As soon as there's more transportation there, by golly gee, it's going to get elsewhere. So we made a little video I'll show you in a moment. And I showed this video at the World Health Organization in January 2014. And their jaws dropped. This was about what would happen if Ebola got to a major airport and spread around the world. Not a pretty picture. And they were really surprised. And I read the surprise as being, you know, hey, we expect the future to look like the past. But the future is not going to look like the past in this context. Do you see that?
Yep.
So 2014, 2 months later, Ebola broke out in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And that summer, it was out of control. It was shooting up every 2 weeks, it was doubling. You keep doing that for a few more months, and you were going to have, and these were the projections, you were going to have millions of people dead, and that's if it didn't get out of West Africa. So we spoke with people, and clearly you can tell from our analysis, we would recommend that there be care about travel. Now, you don't have to stop people from traveling. What you have to do is make sure that the disease doesn't get elsewhere. So you need appropriate screening and maybe, time for people to be observed until you know that they're okay. So there are ways to do it. I mean, you don't have to go off the deep end completely, but you have to be careful because the risk is high. Now, the second thing was, how do you stop it in West Africa? And part of the answer is travel limitations in West Africa, so you can isolate it in particular communities. But when we spoke with people, they didn't know what else to do. So we came up with a second piece of strategy, a piece of strategy that relies on what we would call community response. It's all hands on deck kind of response. So to understand this, this is a picture of what happens. You have people that are susceptible. They get exposed to Ebola. So they're infected, but they don't show any symptoms. And then they show symptoms, and after they show symptoms, they're infectious. But while they're showing symptoms and infectious, those symptoms are like any other any other viral infection. So nobody knows that they have Ebola. So it's like having a cold or the flu until they start really having bad symptoms. It's later. And by the time it happens later, there are a whole bunch of other people that are infected. So it turns out there's a way to solve this problem, which is you go around in communities, door to door, and you monitor people's temperature. And if they have a fever, you arrange for them to be observed until you can check whether they have Ebola or not. And if you do that, you can stop the disease. So we came up with this strategy. In fact, we were going to send Army Corps of Engineer people over to Liberia and have whole teams and all this stuff. And I called Liberia people. I was trying to get the government to do this here, and boy, they were not moving. It just was taking too long. And you don't have time. 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, I mean, it's a totally different ballgame. So you can't wait. So I called the people in Liberia who were doing the response. And I talked with them about this. And they said, 3 weeks ago, we started going door to door with neighborhood teams. They just had the neighborhood, people walk around the neighborhood with these, laser forehead thermometers. Infrared, not laser, whatever, infrared forehead thermometers. And they did it themselves. This is what happened. Boom. Mid-August. Epidemic growing unbelievably. Epidemic falling really rapidly right after they implemented this. I can tell you that 2 months later, there are news reports from people sitting in these facilities that they built to receive patients, Ebola patients, that are empty. And they're saying, we don't know what happened. The people must be hiding. They must be hiding the bodies. And I was sitting in Boston, and I knew exactly what happened. So they stopped the epidemic. It took 3 months until they moved this same strategy to Sierra Leone. Same thing happened. It started dropping like a rock. And in Guinea, it took a little bit longer for them to start doing things. And in fact, there they ended up doing community quarantines in order to stop things. So we did a little simulation. I can show you the simulation of this. And this is a little model where we show how, the exposed people become infectious, and then we implement, either we do or do not implement quarantines of communities. Quarantines, by the way, doesn't mean you walk away from people. It means that you prevent people from infecting others, but you actually go in and you treat people and take care of them. That's the right way to do a quarantine. That's like you quarantine a person, right? You isolate them. So you can quarantine communities in the same way. And if you stop the disease within a few weeks, it's surely worthwhile if you have a disease like Ebola. And that's what people realized in Guinea. And everyone was worried about communities not liking this, but eventually Guinea communities, they said, yeah, let's do this. We'll get rid of this disease. Surprise. But you have to do it the right way. You want to treat people well. and take care of them, make sure they have food and everything else that they need. But here's what we found. This is our simulation. Pandemic going up, you introduce an intervention. I'll be done in a moment, so let me just finish up.
Okay.
Then it turns out that you only need 50% of compliance. So, you never get 100% compliance. And if you look, people were saying, well, if you do anything, there will be a big intervention, people won't comply, and so you won't be able to get things to happen. It turns out if 50% compliance happens, even 40% compliance, this works. It doesn't have to be that well done. And in fact, when we compare with the data, it seems that indeed the effectiveness was only about 50%. And it still worked. And the data fits. All right, what's the question?
Does anyone have a question? I don't see anyone. We got 4 more
Okay.
minutes.
All right. So let me do a few things to tail up. Let's do something fun because it's too much to talk about the bad stuff. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've been looking at Twitter behavior. And we can see, I mean, this is New York, but we've done it for all, major cities around the world. You can just watch people, get up and go to work and go home and go to sleep. And, you can see how the groups of people, not groups, but sort of everyone is behaving. This is people going from the suburbs into Manhattan and tweeting from work and then going home and tweeting from home and then going to sleep. I won't tell the details, but that's it. Then we can do this globally. So we can watch people waking up and going to sleep and, what they do all the way around the world. And we have a nice paper that shows about how the dynamics of global cities is happening. In fact, it turns out that a lot of cities are synchronizing. So everyone's talking to each other. And we can look at how people feel. So we can do text analysis and see whether people are happy or sad. And the cyan in this picture is positive and the magenta is negative. However, surprise, surprise, is people in parks and green spaces are happy and people in traffic jams are unhappy. Is that surprising? Probably not. There's a sewage dump down here. That's E1. It stinks like hell and people are not happy around there. So that's it. I could do 2 minutes about lifespan extension. Do you want to hear about that? How long do you want to live? 2 minutes?
It looks like the audience is interested.
Okay. So here's the question. Why do we die? Is it a natural process that is kind of unavoidable? Or is it something that we can find the elixir of life? So how would you answer that question scientifically? Let me just tell you the answer. It turns out that the key question has to do with biology and evolution. The reason why it has to do with biology and evolution is that the question really is, if the longest lifespans are already being selected by evolution, then we're not going to be able to extend it very easily. You might imagine some technology that would do it, but it's outside of standard biology. The other possibility is that evolution is actually choosing our lifespan. The fact that we live about 100 years is determined by an evolutionary process that happened 1 million years ago that was dependent upon the environment in which we lived at that time. And therefore, there are switches in us that we can change to extend. So it turns out that if you use traditional statistics, you end up with the former answer. Lifespans are always extended. Why? Because why would any individual give up some of their lifespan? The selfish things to do is to live as long as possible. It turns out that when you use spatial models with patterns that violate the assumptions of statistics, you get the opposite answer. And the answer is generic. That means that basically always evolution is selecting and determining our lifespan, including ours and fish and birds and so on. There's actually a lot of empirical evidence for this, but the theory has dominated the thinking. Nowadays, there are people who are iconoclastic and they just look for life extension methods regardless of what the theory says. But what we did, and we have a paper published about it, is we showed that in fact lifespan is selected by evolution. And therefore there is a fundamental reason why we should be able to find a switch and extend our lives, I don't know, tenfold or something. Why not? So I'll catch you in the next century after we do this, assuming that we do this in a few years so that I'll be around. Otherwise, some of the students will be around, and they may enjoy this, even though I won't. Okay?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much, Yaneer. I guess if anybody does have a question, we can try to answer it here. If anybody has a follow-up question, I think we have one at least, maybe two, so we'll try one here first.
Can we go back to the stock market? I liked your comment on how you're kind of tracking the, what's it called, the quantitative easing that's propping up the stock market. So what's your prognosis for the next year or two on the next crash?
You want to figure out how I'm going to advise you to invest? So the problem is that the system is being propped up. Will it reach an instability point? Very possibly. However, in order to do that analysis, we have to do the analysis. And we haven't published it yet. But we're in process. So you might want to sign up for our mailing list.
All right, we'll go with another question here.
Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. Could you put up the chart that extends the 2011 to 2016 ethanol, or the corn price chart or food price chart?
Yeah, you want to ask me how it goes beyond there? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Oh, there's one more. This one. Yes.
Well, does that go all the way to 2016?
No, it doesn't. In fact, what happened afterwards, right, you know that oil prices went through the floor.
Right.
So that was the bursting of the bubble in oil prices, which everyone said was not an artificial bubble, but was. And it was extended by the dynamics of the oil markets. And we've been able to fit that too, but we haven't published it yet. So the point is that the oil prices went down and so did food prices at that time. This was what, a year, is it 2 years ago now, a year ago? I'm losing track. What?
Fall of 2014.
Fall of 2014. So 2 years ago. So it crashed and the food prices went down. You've noticed it's been a little bit more peaceful around the world? Mm-hmm. Well, that's because food prices have been lower. But guess what? They're on their way back up. So if you want to, hopefully, we want to stick around. But as the prices are getting higher now, there's every reason to believe that we're going to end up in trouble again. But the dynamics are kind of a little bit more complicated now because, and I don't want to go into details right now, but the point is that over time, these ringing oscillations are playing off against each other. So we until now, and so I'm not going to claim anything specific about the dynamics, but there is no reason to believe that there can't be another large excursion upward.
Well, is the ethanol phenomenon, as far as the price, driving that of corn and then that driving global food prices, could that have been like a one-time rat through a snake, where there's been improvements in farm productivity and such, not where that effect won't take place again? So did it come down in 2016 to 120 or 100 and then it's going back up again, or how radically did it come down?
It didn't go down that low. I think it went down to about 160. The point is that the ethanol is making the baseline. And you're right that in principle, over time, they may improve production that will have an effect. This is so rapid that there were other adjustments were not fast enough. But the main reason that ethanol is probably not increasing further the prices, so that this kind of stopped here, is because we hit the blend wall.
Right.
There's just not, you cannot make more ethanol out of corn. So they've been, fighting this out in the courts and so on with the EPA, which is responsible for the rules. But it is not true that the price went down. If you look at it, the equilibrium price necessarily went down a lot. If you look at these peaks, you'll see that they're both on the positive side mostly. But the crash of the commodity prices was almost surely just a negative peak, the speculative anti-bubble, if you will. There's no reason that that can't happen. In fact, it was supposed to happen over here, and then there was the drought. So you have to look at these things in a little bit more detail, but the bottom line is no, ethanol has not stopped being a cause of food price increases. It's still it's still eating up 45% of U.S. corn, which is a huge fraction of global grain. And what we do with that will remain to be seen.
All right, Yaneer. Oh, one more question? You have a question? All right, I guess we're staying a little over for you, making it worth all of our while. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Okay.
I was just wondering about the Ebola case that you're talking about. Was it wise for countries around the world to send doctors and nurses, or did it not matter because all these monitoring techniques that you mentioned were implemented?
I think it's, I think we have to understand that all problems now are global. We cannot cut off parts of the world and survive it. What we have to do is we have to engage in a smart way. So I do think that sending doctors and nurses was the right thing to do, both morally and in many ways practically. What we needed to do is to figure out the process of having them come home in a way that's safe. And there really wasn't that much secret about it in terms of what needed to be done. And whether we did exactly the right thing or not exactly the right thing at that time, that you can debate. The reason why I think we didn't do quite enough is because we weren't sensitive to what are called black swan events, rare events that have big impact. So if someone came back and infected a couple of people, the health authorities are not worried about it. And that's what they kind of said. We're not worried about it because it'll only be a couple of people, which is what happened in Texas. But in principle, there was a possibility of a rare event that would have a lot of people infected in a major urban area. That would happen if someone that came back was in the food service industry, for example, maybe, or someone that's shaking a lot of people's hands, or something like that, or thrown up on the subway in New York, or on a bus somewhere. So there are scenarios, or in a bus station, there are scenarios where we would not have been able to stop an epidemic in the United States. And that's scary. Because if you think Texas would survive if New York was infected significantly, I got to tell you that we are really interconnected. So there's no way that I know to stop a large event of Ebola in the United States. So, and if you think about it, that same thing would be true about India or China. It's ridiculous. So what we really needed to do was to go there, take responsibility for making sure that the people there were taken care of and the disease didn't get elsewhere. And we need to understand how to do this. I mean, there are diseases that if, depending upon the latent period and the infectiousness and so on, that we're just toast globally. What we need to do is to figure out how to respond to particular diseases, because some diseases don't require any response. And others diseases require, getting out the cavalry and going after it. And if we don't do the right thing, if we don't understand how to do the right thing, then the predictions that I made will be true. What I mean by that is that all of the predictions that we make are dependent upon the policies and responses that we engage in. So it's up to us to decide on the right way to do things and not the wrong way to do things. If you will, choosing life or death. And that's a choice that we have. Right now, we're not really making the right choices. And that's not a good thing. So I've been kind of talking about this. But what we really need is a big effort. And I'm hoping that the students there, whether on one problem or on another problem, will recognize that we all have a responsibility to engage in this. That doesn't mean every one of us, right? That would be a bad idea. But surely the society as a whole has to engage in this. And my hope is that by understanding the really fundamental risk that we're engaged in today, and it's a global risk, nobody can run away from this problem. It is a global problem. Go ahead.
There was a question if you've actually
Please.
tracked any other viruses and correlated any models besides Ebola.
Yeah, we've been working on Zika recently. Zika, as many of you know, is considered to be the main cause of microcephaly in Brazil. So one of the problems that we should be addressing is how to get rid of the mosquitoes. So in this case, we didn't really study the epidemic itself because I care more about saving people than I care about following what's happening. For me to predict a little bit better where you're going to have Zika or not Zika is kind of besides the point. What can we do to stop it? And the answer, it turns out, is not that hard, believe it or not. Should I tell you about it?
Go for it.
Okay, so the way you get rid of mosquitoes that carry Zika virus around normally is two things. You eliminate stagnant water because that's where they breed. And second of those, you spray insecticide. So the insecticide has problems, particularly for this mosquito, because this mosquito breeds around homes, inside and around homes. And the stagnant water works up to a point, but then you always forget one. You don't know where it is. It's around the corner in the shed. It's, whatever. So you can work hard at it, but it turns out there's a trick. You put out water. You put out little containers of water around your house, and you number them so that you remember where they are. And every day you go there and you drain them. What's that going to do? It's going to get the mosquitoes to lay their eggs, and then you're going to dump the eggs. That turns out it can crash the mosquito population. They use this as part of policy in Australia and in the Philippines. And it's been pilot tested in Brazil using community response. Remember, Ebola response was a community response. This is also a community response. You get everybody in a community to do this, and you're done with the mosquitoes. Even if 10% of people do it. There's another question over there. Yeah. So that's part of the solution. I can finish the story in a moment and tell you that, by the way, it's not entirely clear that Zika is the cause of microcephaly. It's the cause of some microcephaly. But the data is not really supporting that it's the cause of most of the microcephaly. And we've been trying to figure out what else might be the cause. And one of the possibilities, we don't know if it is, but one of the possibilities that it's actually the insecticide that they're putting in drinking water in Brazil. That's pretty horrendous. Anyway, go ahead. Next question.
I'm curious to hear what you think about genetically modifying Aedes aegypti populations to create non-breeding versions of the mosquito that carries Zika and dengue.
Really bad idea.
Care to elaborate?
if the end of the world was coming and your only solution was to breed genetically modified mosquitoes, I would say go for it. But several layers. Despite the claims, genetically modified mosquitoes do not solve the problem. They make a dent in the mosquito population, maybe over a short period of time. But if you look at the data, it's totally bogus. The companies that are producing them have a lot of reason to promote them, but the real data is not supporting that they can do much. The second thing, however, is different. Have you ever heard of something called the precautionary principle? The precautionary principle basically says you can go out and walk in front of a car if you want, but policymakers shouldn't take the world out and walk it in front of a car. Which means that we shouldn't take risks that threaten the entire world, like with Ebola, for example. Policymakers need to make their decisions in a conservative way, because if you take a risk of destroying the world 1 in 1,000 times, and you do that 1,000 times, the world is toast. It's gone. Is that clear? So even low amounts of risk, seemingly low amounts of risk, are not reasonable for policymakers to take. Genetically modifying organisms, including plants like corn that we're doing today, and including mosquitoes, is tinkering with complex systems. It's not just the plant itself, but it's the ecosystem. It's the farming ecology. It's all of the stuff that we really don't understand yet because of these indirect effects that are part of complex system science and not part of traditional statistics. What's been happening is that the biologists have gotten really excited about the fact that they understand how to engineer things. At the same time, the engineers are beginning to recognize that they cannot figure out how to manipulate complex systems. So we have a real problem in that the biological side is saying, hey, we have all these neat tools, let us at it. And my answer is, hold off a bit. Let's figure out things a little bit more and a little bit more carefully before we take risks with it. And I know that there's a huge publicity campaign from Monsanto that's trying to claim that anybody that opposes genetically modified organisms is not scientific. They just don't believe in science. It's like being against global warming or being against, being for flat Earth, or pick your other analogy. That's what they're claiming. Okay? And I don't care how anybody feels about politics or other things. But I know that the people who are arguing this are not engaged in understanding risk. They don't think about the large impact, low probability events that are outside of statistics, right? You do a statistical experiment, and if something happens 5% of the time, well, it's not statistically significant. So it doesn't matter in a statistics experiment. But if those events that happen 5% of the time are the destruction of the world, you better be careful. And that's the problem. Does that answer your question?
It does, yes.
Thank you, Yaneer. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much. It's one of the extended session because everybody wanted to hear more details. So,
there's one more thing. We do have a website. You're welcome to distribute my email to everybody so they can be in touch with me with questions. And I'll look forward to hearing with you, or I look forward to having you join us.
okay, yeah, I'd like to follow up. I think you could help the last paper I submitted for sure. And some people were asking about the presentation, but should we point people to your papers, or are there presentations available, or slides, or?
The presentation slides itself are not usually distributed because if you'll notice, they don't have any of the words.
Right, right.
So what I recommend is to go to the papers. There's an overview section on our website, which has some methodology parts, some basic concept parts, and also some policy application parts.
Okay. Thank you very much again, and until next time, I'll follow up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Pleasure to talk. Take care. Bye-bye.